Welcome everybody to another episode of History's Benchwarmers. You were greeted again by me, Adam.
And Rich.
And we have our first official series that we're going to be doing for you. So we're going to be talking about the Middle East. We're going to be first starting with ancient Mesopotamia, mostly talking about 10,000 B.C.E., so about 12,000 years ago. It's a big jump in history terms for civilization. But we'll be starting there, and then we'll be ending in the Islamic Golden Age. So, Rich, you want to start us off about what we're going to talk about?
Yeah, so essentially the idea of us studying Mesopotamian culture and the Middle East was to understand this Islamophobia that's going on in the world today. We know that in the media and society today, we're just like, hey, we've got this mass influx of Syrian refugees coming in, but we don't know what to do with them. We as in the United States, not just like me and Adam, but, citizens of the United States. It's a debate going on in politics, it's debating going on throughout the world, essentially, because we can argue that we are the ones who caused a lot of the problems there, but these problems have been going on forever. And in order to understand those problems, Adam and I were discussing, it's like, hey, it's probably important to understand the history of an area before we go into talking about politics or trying to understand anything that's going on in that region today. Us being history's benchwarmers, we need to discuss topics like this. So starting 10,000 BCE, so 10,000 years before Christ, before the Common Era. Long time ago. So original writings of what we know of ancient Mesopotamia come from Sumer. Writings didn't start till about 3,300 BCE. Essentially, that's still 2,000 years before ancient Rome, to give you some context of how old it is. But we know that human history goes back much further. And we know human history stems back into different periods where it's starting as, like a caveman, hunter-gatherer society that's then stemmed into the first agricultural revolution called the Neolithic Age. Essentially what we are going to be looking at, starting off, is this place called Göbekli Tepe. If I didn't pronounce it right, sorry, you can correct me in the comments. So Göbekli Tepe, so yeah, you just pronounced it a different way. But Göbekli Tepe essentially was found in 1968 and was presumed to be a medieval burial site. Göbekli Tepe, to give you some context on where it's at, it's in the Anatolian region of Turkey, or modern day Turkey. So it's like the southern point going more towards the Middle East. In 1994, German archaeologists went in and they discovered that it was not just a medieval burial site. It was actually one of the very first civilizations that were in place. So we know that the Neolithic Revolution, well, if you don't know what it is, it's when human beings decided to stop following the stars, stop following weather patterns, and stop following the animals, and they started farming and domesticating animals. It's called the Neolithic Revolution because humans finally decided, hey, I'm going to settle down and I'm going to build my own place. I'm going to have my own farm, grow my own sheep, grow my own cow, and not have to go out hunting and essentially risk dying in any awful way. If you've ever watched the movie 10,000 BCE, you know. So Göbekli Tepe was 10,000 BCE. We don't know much about that society because writing was not invented yet. But what we do know is what is there through pottery. And what their pottery and the pillars and essentially the art that came from that time. So when we think of caveman or Neolithic era, what usually you think of, or at least my mind usually goes to, is cave drawings, cave writings. Like the Native Americans here in the States, they had cave drawings of buffalo and whatever they were hunting or chasing or whatever the case was. Göbekli Tepe is special because they were actually making pottery. They were making clay figurines of people. They were making clay figurines of gods. They were making clay figurines of animals. They were making limestone pillars. Limestone is an extremely difficult stone to try to carve into, and these people figured out how. Göbekli Tepe was not a very big archaeological dig, but it was still big enough to be critical in human history. Göbekli Tepe was this site where humans in the Neolithic era, it was the very, very beginning. So there's no signs that they had pens for animals. There's no signs that they had farms. What they did find was housing. That's significant to us because that shows that human beings were no longer moving around. They're finally starting to settle down. On top of that, they're creating artwork to describe their life, which is significant because that helps us as historians try to understand what their life was like. So they had these statues. Essentially, they were T-shaped statues with animals. We know that animals were huge, so animism was huge for them because that's what was around. So essentially, they may have revered them as gods. The fox, the snake, the lion, whatever type of animals that they had in these pillars, they revered them as gods because that's what they feared. So they paid them respects and putting them on statues, hoping that would keep them away. At least as in my interpretation, and maybe completely wrong, but that's my interpretation of it. Having representations of gods as human beings, as like gods incarnate, it's not a new concept to us, but to them, that's super significant because instead of people following weather patterns and moving around and following animals, they're finally settling down and thinking, hey, is there more to this life? So, yeah, that essentially, 12,000 years ago.
Hmm?
It doesn't sound like on a timeline like a significantly large chunk of time, but that's huge because that is essentially the first civilization of human society.
Hmm? And something that we're going to see a lot when talking about the ancient Middle East and ancient Mesopotamia is that empires come and they go. They start and they end very rapidly because these are thousands of years. If you want to think about it, us to the Romans is about 2,000 years. And you've seen how far we've progressed as human beings from then. I mean, looking back even farther than that, Romans studying about ancient Mesopotamia is almost fourfold of what we're learning about Romans. That's such a far time that we're learning about. And one of the things that we have to understand is what really characterizes a civilization. And as we've seen, we haven't really gotten a lot of writings from this time, but if we move on, we'll really see in the times of like Uruk and Ubayd? Ubayd. We see that these city-states that start to crop up actually start having these writings. They have a social structure. They have city-states that really start to make a difference in this time. They start building their own armies. People start settling down in these areas. They start using agricultural places. They start having animal husbandry. And they're able to kind of stand on their own for a little bit. They have a form of taxation. I mean, you guys wonder, when you look at pay stubs, you're like, wow, taxes are being taken out because they have, we have a government that does that needs money from us so that they can run everything. That's what they were doing back then too. Maybe they didn't have the currency that we have, but they definitely had some type of exchange of goods between the government or between themselves. So going into this Uruk period, we start getting into the epics of Gilgamesh, right? And we start seeing these things called ziggurats, which were temples that were built. If you see them, they're kind of, they're like a base square that kind of on top of it is a smaller square and on top and on top and on top.
So it's like the precursor to the pyramids in Egypt.
Right.
One of the most famous ziggurats would be Tower of Babel. So if you look up the Tower of Babel, it's going to be like this spiral thing that it's got like a torn down top. Religiously, if you look into the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Bible, the gods tore down this tower because human beings thought this is a story. We don't know if this is actually fact or not, but the story goes that human beings had become so cocky, so arrogant that they put themselves at the same level as the gods, and the gods did not like that. So looking, oh man, I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the god I was going to say. But the gods didn't like that. And they thought that human beings were arrogant. They thought that human beings were trying to be better than them. So essentially what they did is they said, hey, we're going to tear down this tower. We're going to destroy and disperse humankind so that they are no longer together. So that they have confusion of tongues. Because the Tower of Babel, the story goes that all human beings were scientifically, historically, and linguistically aligned. And it was through that Tower of Babel, the ziggurat, that the gods were just like, hey, no, we're going to tear this down. Because this tower was supposedly so tall, it reached to the sky, and it was up to where the gods were. So they tore it down, and the way that they wanted to destroy human beings was through the flood.
Yes, and so one of the parallel stories that we can actually see from the Sumerian culture and the Bible in the Old Testament is the flood. Now, there's kind of two stories that go with that. In the Sumerian culture, they say that, it's kind of funny actually, the way that they tell the story is that human beings were partying too much. And they kind of disrupted the sleep of the gods, and the gods didn't like that very much. And so what they did was they created a great flood that kind of wiped out
Enki.
Yeah.
Enki is the name of the god. I don't know why it took me forever to remember that, sorry. But Enki was the god. He was known as the destroyer god, and he was so angry that he was disturbed. And he's just like, who are these humans to disturb my sleep? I need some rest, man.
Mm-hmm. And so what happens is he flooded the earth. Now, just a little bit of context about that area before we talk about the Bible version of that, of Noah. The Indus, not the Indus, the Mesopotamia, those two important rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, were very much different than the Nile and the Indus Valley rivers, only because they were uncertain. They were very uncertain and random, and quite dangerous, actually, too. Like the Nile, they knew when it would flood and it would come up and it would go down. Same with the Indus Valley. However, there were so many different canals between the Tigris and Euphrates that they couldn't really pinpoint it. The same times of year would come around, and sometimes it wouldn't happen. It would happen the day before, or a day after, or a week, or a month before. And it was kind of random, and they couldn't really have a good idea of when things were going to happen. And when it rained and it flooded, and it rained. So much so that they created these stories that kind of, the end of civilization almost. And so when you look at the Old Testament with Noah, that great flood still comes in that idea, right? If you move a little bit further after Noah, you see that Abraham comes from Ur. And Ur is in that same region of Uruk, that same area of Mesopotamia. So you can kind of see the parallels between these two cultures and these two ways that these two religions kind of describe almost the same event.
Well, these two cultures, these ancient Mesopotamian cultures, so the Israelites and the Babylonians, the Assyrians, they all were living in the same area known as the Fertile Crescent. Mm-hmm. The Fertile Crescent comes from these flooding rivers, because every time the rivers would flood, they would leave these soil deposits of just rich, nutrient-filled soil where people could farm.
Right. But at the same time, after all of this flooding, you had that. But again, it was kind of random. There were rainy seasons, yes, but it was kind of harder to pinpoint when it would. So it would be harder to kind of build these civilizations on there. And with civilization comes a hierarchy, comes a social structure. Who's on top and who's on bottom. We discussed before that these ziggurats, when you see them, kind of like the first formations of pyramids. At the very top, the only people who were allowed up there were priests. And priests were very valuable for the fact that they could speak to the gods. Yeah. Which is huge, because if you look at any early civilizational culture, the people who could speak to the divine were very much more important than a king or a chieftain or the common people, because they could communicate with those who kind of had the power to create these floods and create these different kinds of weathers in nature and move animals away or bring animals in. So these people were very valuable. And in these cultures, the kings and the chieftains would try to connect themselves as much as they could into these religious cultures. So much so that they would end up becoming prince priests, which gives them that kind of divine right to rule, right? And they have the power to back them up for their rule, but they also have the divine right, which is crazy because if you look at in European history later in the modern era, you kind of see that idea still come around, and same thing in Rome and in Greece and all these different areas.
Absolutely.
So, again, where does these things start? And maybe in ancient Mesopotamia.
Yeah, essentially that's where many historians argue that society and human life started was the Mesopotamian era. At least civilization-wise, not human beings themselves, but civilization-wise. One of the significant things in this area is that it has always been filled with constant turmoil, war. The Bible, the Old Testament Bible, is filled with so many war stories. The city of Jericho was actually a city. Was it torn down by horns when the Israelites would march around? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know how it was torn down. But the ruins were found. And we know that it was like 7,000 B.C.E. that city existed. So for a city to have existed that long, you have these priests and these kings who want the most fertile land, who want to get the best type of animals, who want the best hunting lands. So why wouldn't they go to war? The whole Old Testament story of Moses after he freed the Israelites and after they found their way to the Promised Land, getting into Canaan, the whole moral of that story was, hey, we need this land because this is our land, because this is the best land, the land of milk and honey. And that maybe it was literal, maybe it wasn't. But milk and honey meaning that land was filled with prosperity, rich soil, full of animals, full of just life so that humans can thrive in a society and build and grow themselves.
And that's something huge too. If you look at most civilizations, they all start around bodies of water. Because, like you stated, Rich, it's fertile area. It's soil that's good and it's rich to have crops. And animals want to live next to the water hole. Why? Because there's water and there's food, either from other animals or from the plants that grow there.
Yeah.
And on top of that, with people comes civilization, and that comes trade. People that were living in the southern part of the Tigris River could now sail up the river and get more trading and more stuff that they don't have in the south, right? And that's the same thing why this area of, when we get towards modern day Israel or Palestine, you can see that near the coast is why it's so important, because the farther you get, it's a lot more desert-like. The terrain is a lot different than if you go near the coast. And that area of milk and honey, if you know the terrain, you can understand why it would be so important for these people to live in these areas and to live next to bodies of water.
Yes.
And without it...
Well, if you look at any, before modern technology, where were most cities? They weren't really located in the middle of nowhere. They were located next to bodies of water. Whether it was a river, a lake, an ocean. It was located next to water so that they had that supply and the ability to trade. If you look at, anything in the ancient time period of Europe and like that Mediterranean era, all the cities were coastal.
Mm-hmm. And so, like I stated earlier, we kind of see this rise and fall of empires and city-states. Because again, guys, we're not dealing with the same concept of countries that we deal with today. We're kind of dealing with more of an ancient version of how the Greeks used to do things. Back when the Greeks were, when we study about the Thermopylae and the Greeks in the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian Wars, we deal with city-states. People who have kind of the same culture and same religion, but different identities.
Yes.
They don't consider themselves the same. So people who live near the south of the Tigris River and people who live in the north of the Tigris River might as well have just been wearing antennas, to be honest, because they just considered themselves different people. Yes, the same type of religion, maybe the same type of language, but different nonetheless. And we're not dealing with this consensus that we see today. Our borderlines, which I tried so hard to see if I can find pictures that didn't have current country borderlines in them, is because people didn't consider it back then. People used natural divisions, lakes, rivers, oceans, tree lines, desert lines, to really divide up their land. and it wasn't as we see it today, because a lot of the Epic of Gilgamesh has kind of like a subtle undertone of country versus city-state, and the city-state always wins out. But as we see, the city-state, when it tries to expand further and further out, it ends up more crumbling from the inside. We see something like taxes, as I stated earlier, something that's super important to make sure that a government runs properly, that a city-state has the proper necessities and the money and the food to support all of the people that are living there, right? And all of these people are now, the country or the city-state is dependent on these people. And again, guys, if we look at that social hierarchy, you have the priests and the kings and chieftains on top and everybody else at the bottom. Yes, you kind of have this warrior type class, but it's more of the recruiting of regular citizens, farmers, right? And without them, it starts to fall. And what happens when your only source of income is rice and grain and animals? What happens when there's a famine? What happens when there's a drought? What happens when it floods? What happens is that people can't pay that, and the government demands more. And if the government demands more of nothing that's there, then they start to riot. People start to riot, or the government start to crumble. And so we see these periods of city-states building up and being destroyed constantly. Again, guys, it's thousands of years, right? From the Romans to us, I mean, we've seen that we've come so far. But even the time between late antiquity, when Rome kind of diminished and medieval kingdoms started, we can see that there was a time where what Rome built got destroyed and something else was built in its place, in a Western standpoint. And the same thing goes back thousands and thousands of years, that it happens so often. Because remember, we're not dealing with hundreds of years, guys. We're dealing with thousands. We're not dealing with the 7th century BC. We're dealing with the 7th millennia BC, which is very different when you look at the context of civilization and people.
Well, to put it into that context, like, look at the Bible. When, look at the story of David and Goliath. Goliath, this big giant, and David, this small little guy, coming in and killing him with a stone. Even the ancient Bible has these undertones of war, of trying to establish themselves and take another country's place. And then, arguing religion at this point. Yeah, the Israelites were one of the first to be monotheistic, meaning that they only believed in one God. But that God was still significant in violence, in war, and being a supporting deity to the Israelites. And if they did not worship him, they were punished. That goes for the same thing for these ancient Mesopotamian religions. A lot of the demons that we have today were ancient Mesopotamian religions. So, like, the demon Baal was a god in Mesopotamia. He was a Babylonian or Assyrian god. We derive a lot of our history, our meaning Christian people, a lot of our biblical history from this time period. So it's more significant than we realize. So that going into like the political sphere, this may veer off away from the ancient topic, but going into the political sphere of today, that Islamophobia is not new. People hated Zoroastrianism, which is one of the very first monotheistic religions, and they kind of introduced the duality when it comes to religion, so like the good and the evil. They derived a lot of history from that, and the Israelites hated that religion. The Israelites hated the Babylonian gods, the Assyrian gods. For a good purpose, right? The Israelites were taken into captivity and, taken away from the land of Canaan, the land of milk and honey. But a lot of the history that we have can be taken from the Bible, because the Bible was written down. The ancient Bible was written down for us to understand how the Israelites lived. Yes, the undertone is, hey, if you don't believe in God, that you're going to be taken away and you'll be punished, right? That's the moral. But looking at a historical aspect, that's not so much it. It's more of like, hey, yeah, maybe we were taken into captivity, but we were able to see the way these other societies lived, which is so significant to us, especially as historians.
Yeah. And one of the things I'm just thinking about earlier is if you look at Abraham, he had two sons, right? It was Ishmael and, was it Isaac?
Yes.
Isaac and Ishmael, right? And an angel of God came to the mother of Ishmael when she was banished from the tribe. Yeah, Hagar, by Sarah. She was thrown out because Sarah didn't like the fact that Abraham was kind of spoiling his son, who she kind of encouraged to
not so much that. Sarah wasn't able to bear a child.
Right.
And
Jealousy.
she told Abraham, like, hey, take the slave.
Right.
And the slave Hagar ended up bearing a child named Ishmael, and God then came, angel Gabriel came to Sarah and said that you are going to bear a child, and she's like, at my age, and it was like, what, 1,000 years old or whatever. But again, the age at that time was not like it is today. Age may have been revolutions around the earth, revolutions of the moon. It just very much depends on the context. We really don't know. But we know that she was old and out of childbearing years. Ended up becoming pregnant, giving birth to Isaac, which Isaac and Ishmael are essentially the two different stems of Isaac being Judaism and Christianity, Ishmael being the founder of Islam.
Mm-hmm. And one of the crazy things to think about in the Bible, and it says that an angel of God came to Hagar and told her that your son will have as many descendants as Isaac would, but would always be in conflict with Isaac. And that's something that kind of wrapping everything up, that in this ancient time we see that there was a lot of war. It was kind of the start of civilization as we know it, with society and a higher structure with writings and a language and all of that stuff. But we can see that there's still conflict there. We can see that it's something that has always been there, and something that as we progress through this time, when we start getting into the Achaemenid and the Babylonians and Assyrians, that it's just something that's constant. And whoever is kind of the most powerful is the one who's going to take control and consolidate it all. But right now, in this ancient time, it was a lot harder because people were divided, as we said before, in the city-state. But as we progress further, we'll see that people kind of shed that idea of city-state and more focus on consolidating power into a single person or a single entity. That could be a government or groups of people. So,
yeah, and I think as a closing note, because we are running out of time for this podcast, the whole wrap-up of this is that society in general has been around much longer than we realize. Hate has been around much longer than we realize. The Quran and the Bible have hate undertones built in, and that is preached to us as, followers of any belief. If you were looking at the Abrahamic religions, well, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, that hate undertone of my religion's right, your religion is wrong, is there. And that isn't new. So looking at that connection between Abraham being the founder of Islam and Judaism, Christianity, that starts from there. And it's not new. So the hate stems a long time. Islamophobia stems a long time. It wasn't Islamophobia before, but we'll get into that in the next podcast.
So, thank you guys for joining us again, and I hope to see you guys in the next episode.
Peace.
Peace.